Curiosity first stirred when the townsfolk of Willow Creek saw the stranger walking down the frost-choked road that cut through the heart of their quiet world. She was small and unassuming, a worn shawl drawn close against the biting Wyoming wind, her boots sinking into snow that whispered with every step. No one knew her name yet, but in a place where gossip traveled faster than horses, they would soon have one ready for her. The saloon girls peered from their windows, the blacksmith paused mid-swing, and old Mrs. Abernathy at the inn pressed her face to the frosted glass, muttering, "Another lost soul blowin' in from nowhere." Clara May Dillard, 26 years old, did not feel like she belonged anywhere. Once a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse, she had been dismissed after the school board decided her plainness and lack of charm were not befitting a woman entrusted with shaping young minds. They said she lacked spirit, that she looked too sad, that her eyes made people uncomfortable, eyes that carried more silence than words. She had left without protest, carrying little more than a Bible, 2 dresses, and a folded letter she never opened again. Now, with snowflakes clinging to her lashes, she searched for work and a reason not to give up on herself. Mrs. Abernathy, the innkeeper, offered her a cot in the corner room and a bowl of stew that smelled faintly of onions and judgment. "You'll find folk here don't take kindly to strays," she said as she set the bowl down. "Still, you seem polite enough. Maybe old Callahan needs a hand up at his ranch. He's always got too much land and too little company." Clara thanked her, though she had heard the name before. Everyone had. Rhett Callahan, 33, tall, quiet, and rumored to carry a sadness so heavy even his horses felt it. 3 winters ago, he lost his betrothed to fever, and since then he spoke little to anyone. His ranch, a stretch of snow-covered fences and wind-beaten barns, sat just beyond the river bend. Townsfolk said the place had gone hollow without laughter. Clara listened, her spoon pausing midair, as Mrs. Abernathy went on. "A man like that don't smile easy, but he's fair. Fair's something, these days." That night, Clara sat by the window of her rented room, the cold seeping through the thin walls. She watched flakes drift like lost souls, glowing faintly in the lamplight. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her, unremarkable face, plain dress, eyes that spoke too much. "I'm not pretty," she whispered to no one, as if naming the truth could soften it. But inside her chest, something flickered, an old stubbornness that refused to die out, even when everything else had. Morning came pale and brittle. The sound of hooves on frozen ground drew her to the window again. Rhett Callahan rode into town. He was just as the stories described. Rugged, steady, the sort of man whose silence filled the air more than words could. His horse snorted clouds of steam as he dismounted outside the mercantile. He carried himself like a man used to hardship, not bitterness. The townspeople greeted him with nods instead of words, for his reputation carried both respect and distance. Clara stood at the edge of the street, her hands gripping her shawl tight. She watched him trade for supplies, kerosene, flour, nails, then load his wagon with the efficiency of a man who worked alone too long. She didn't know what courage urged her forward, only that something inside her refused to keep quiet this time. As he turned to mount his horse, she stepped into the path, her voice trembling but clear. "Mr. Callahan, sir?" He paused, turning his face toward her. His eyes, gray, steady, unreadable, met hers through the slow-falling snow. "Yes, ma'am." She faltered, clutching her shawl tighter. "I heard you might need help. I can cook, clean, keep the books. I don't ask much, just a roof and meals." Rhett studied her for a moment that stretched too long. Then he nodded once, slow and measured. "You sure you can handle the cold?" "The cold don't scare me much anymore," she said quietly. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Then come along." He lifted her small satchel into the wagon and offered his hand, not chivalrously, but simply as one worker helps another. The ride to the ranch was silent but strangely gentle. Snow fell thick and steady, muffling the world into stillness. She stole glances at him when she thought he wouldn't notice. The set of his jaw, the faint scar above his brow, the way he kept glancing toward the horizon as if measuring distance not in miles but in memories. He seemed carved from the same earth that raised these mountains, solid, patient, unknowable. By dusk they reached the ranch. It was large yet lonely, the kind of place that held its breath between seasons. The barns leaned under snow, fences creaked in the wind, and the house stood proud but weary. Inside, it smelled of pine smoke and leather, a man's world untouched by softer hands. She set to work immediately, sweeping dust, lighting fires, boiling water. He said little but always with quiet courtesy, never ordering, just asking. "You'll find wood out back, or coffee's in the tin if you take it." By the end of that first night, she had restored a hint of warmth to rooms long cold. Days turned into a rhythm, her tending the hearth, him tending the land. He rose before dawn, returned at dusk, and always thanked her for supper. The silence between them grew familiar, almost comfortable. She began to notice the way his eyes softened when he saw her reading by lamplight, or how he left small kindnesses behind without mentioning them. A folded blanket on her chair, boots drying by the stove. One evening, as wind howled against the shutters, she sat by the fire mending his torn shirt. Her fingers fumbled, clumsy with tiredness. He was repairing a saddle nearby, the glow of the fire painting his face in amber light. Without looking up, she murmured, "I know I'm not pretty, Mr. Callahan. I've heard it enough to believe it." The room went still. Only the crackle of the fire answered. After a long moment, he said quietly, "That's fine." She blinked, confused. "Fine. I don't need fancy," he said, threading his needle again. "I need honest." The words sank into her like warmth after frostbite. Simple, unexpected, disarming. She turned her face from the fire, pretending to focus on her stitches so he wouldn't see the tears welling in her eyes. Outside, snow continued to fall. Soft, unhurried, endless. Inside, two lonely lives sat close enough to feel the heat of the same fire, each too cautious to name the comfort it gave. Yet something had shifted quietly between them, like spring whispering beneath the ice. That night, when she blew out the lamp, she stood for a long moment watching the snow through the window. Somewhere beyond the storm, the rancher's steady silhouette moved through the shadows, checking the stables before bed. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she wanted to find out. The weeks that followed melted slowly into a rhythm as fragile and sacred as a prayer whispered at dawn. Clara rose before the light each morning, her breath clouding the air as she stoked the hearth, her hands raw but steady. She hummed while she worked, soft, wordless tunes that drifted through the house like mist through trees. Rhett listened sometimes from the doorway, his hat in hand, unsure why the sound stilled something restless inside him. Her voice carried no intention, no attempt to charm, and yet it filled the spaces his grief had hollowed out. The ranch had begun to sound alive again. By midwinter, they worked in quiet partnership. She learned the creaks of the house as he knew the moods of the land. Their words were few, but their silences spoke. Sometimes, when she'd carry a pail of water from the well and he met her halfway to take the weight from her hands, their fingers brushed, just a fleeting touch, yet enough to make her heart stumble. He'd look away quickly, as if he'd seen something too pure for his rough world. She would watch his broad shoulders retreat into the snow and think how even silence, when shared, could feel like kindness. The thaw never came quickly in Wyoming. Storms rolled heavy across the valley, turning the sky into a gray sea. One afternoon, Rhett returned from town with supplies. The moment they entered the mercantile, Clara felt the sting of eyes upon her. Whispers rippled through the aisles, soft but sharp as sleet. Mrs. Abernathy's voice rose above the rest, syrupy with mock concern. "Well, Mr. Callahan, we didn't reckon you'd take a lady up to that lonely ranch. She must be good company for a quiet man." The laughter that followed was small but cruel. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the sack of flour she held, her throat tight. She'd known judgment before, but something about hearing it in front of him made her want to vanish into the floorboards. Rhett's hand tightened around the counter. When he spoke, his voice was low, even, but every word carried weight. "You folks judge too quick," he said. "She works harder than most men in this town, and she's earned her place." The store went still. His eyes, cool and steady as a winter sky, swept over the room before he turned and walked out. Clara followed, her pulse racing with something she couldn't name. Outside, the cold wind stung her cheeks, but it was not from shame. It was from pride, quiet, trembling pride in being defended not with pity, but with truth. The ride home was silent except for the creak of the wagon. Snow began to fall, the flakes heavy and relentless. She wanted to thank him but couldn't find the words. He kept his eyes on the horizon, though now and then he glanced her way, as if checking she hadn't shattered under the weight of it all. When they reached the ranch, the storm had thickened into a white curtain. By nightfall, the wind screamed through the eaves, shaking the windows like fists. A crash outside snapped them both alert, the stables. Rhett grabbed his coat. One of the horses spooked. "I'll bring him in." Before she could protest, he was gone, swallowed by the storm. Minutes turned to hours. The blizzard grew wild, erasing everything beyond the door. Clara paced by the window, watching for any sign of movement. Fear gnawed at her resolve until she could no longer sit still. She wrapped herself in a heavy cloak, lit a lantern, and stepped into the night. The cold bit instantly, searing her lungs. The world was nothing but wind and white. She called his name, but the storm stole her voice. Then, faintly, she saw it, a dark shape slumped by the barn wall, half buried in snow. Panic surged. She dropped to her knees, brushing the snow from his face. His skin was pale, his lashes frosted, his lips blue. "Rhett," she gasped, shaking him. "Come back now, don't you go quiet on me." She pulled with all her strength, dragging him inside, her muscles trembling, heart hammering with terror. Inside, she stripped off his soaked coat, wrapped him in blankets, and pressed her hands to his chilled cheeks. His eyes fluttered, unfocused. "You went out there alone," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why do you always face everything alone?" His breathing steadied faintly, his lips twitching into the ghost of a smile. "Didn't plan on anyone comin' after me." "Then you don't know me yet," she murmured, clutching his hand. She didn't let go until dawn. When the storm finally broke, the world outside glittered like a dream. The snow lay deep and untouched, the air sharp with new sunlight. Rhett woke to the smell of broth and the warmth of the fire. He tried to rise, but Clara's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "You'll rest today," she said softly, a firmness in her tone he hadn't heard before. He looked at her for a long moment, as though truly seeing her for the first time. Not as the woman townfolk whispered about, not as the plain stranger who'd asked for work, but as the quiet strength that had carried him through the night. He reached for her hand, his touch unsteady but sure. "You brought me back." She smiled faintly. "You just needed someone to remind you what home feels like." For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer hollow. It was full, alive, beating softly like a second heart. He wanted to say more, to tell her what he hadn't dared name, but words felt too small. Instead, he covered her hand with both of his, letting that single gesture speak what language never could. As days passed, the snow began to soften and slide from the rooftops. Icicles melted into silver streams that trickled down the eaves. The ranch breathed again. Rhett's strength returned, but something deeper had changed. He no longer carried his solitude like a burden. Clara's laughter, rare, quiet, and beautiful, seemed to echo through the halls that had long forgotten sound. One evening, they sat on the porch, the horizon burning gold. The air smelled faintly of thawing earth. Rhett leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice low. "You've done more for this place than I ever could, Clara May. You brought it back to life." She shook her head, eyes soft. "No, Rhett. It was never dead. It was just waiting to be seen again." He smiled then, slow, real, unguarded. The kind of smile that looked like sunrise after a long winter. When she turned her gaze toward the fields, a hush fell between them. Somewhere out there, spring was coming, though neither rushed to meet it. For now, the warmth of the fading day and the quiet closeness between them was enough. And though neither spoke the word, both knew what it was. Love had not arrived loud or sudden. It had crept in gently, honest and uninvited, like sunlight through frost. It had found them exactly as they were, imperfect, ordinary, and, at last, alone.